It's been 4.5 years since Occupy Wall Street protests took over the New York City financial district. The original protest inspired similar protests around the globe and brought debates about income inequality into the spotlight. But what does one of the co-founders of the movement think of it now? Yesterday, I spoke to Micah White. He's co-founder of the Occupy Wall Street movement. He's also the author of a new book called The End of Protest. You say in your book several times, it seems to be a real premise of the book, is that Occupy Wall Street, of which you were a founder, one of the leading personalities, was either a failure, or you often use the phrase constructive failure. And I find that striking because it seems to me that in the years since, we've seen the phrase one percenters gain common currency in the lexicon. People know what that refers to. It's a statement about income inequality. We've seen the rise of Bernie Sanders, the most left-wing political candidate in the United States in a long, long time. Some people say that Black Lives Matter has taken inspiration from Occupy Wall Street. So why do you consider Occupy Wall Street to have been what you call either a failure at some times or a constructive failure?
I mean, that is a really excellent question, and that's the kind of the core thing that we need to consider, which is that a lot of activism right now likes to tell these endlessly positive stories where nothing's ever a failure, you know, and they say, well, we didn't fail, we just kind of splintered into 1,000 shards of light. But I call Occupy Wall Street a constructive failure, not a total failure, but a constructive failure, to highlight that we did not achieve what we set out to do. We did not get money out of politics. We did not overthrow the rule of the 1%. We did not fundamentally issue the kind of revolutionary social change that at that time we really believed we were going to do. And so these other benefits, these positive things that have happened, like making activism cool again and spreading our message, those are secondary benefits. Those are symptoms of the size of our movement, the global spread of our movement. But they are not they are not what we set out to do. And unless we can acknowledge that it was a constructive failure, then we're unable to learn from our failure. And I think we see that with movements like Black Lives Matter, who have, I think, failed to learn from the constructive failure of Occupy Wall Street.
Isn't it very, very naive? Some critics will say it's very, very naive to expect through the occupation of a park in South Manhattan for a couple of months and the enormous media coverage that attended that, to change something like income inequality in the United States, to change, in particular, the large amount of money that gets funneled into political campaigns. I think what this was largely about was a Supreme Court decision several years ago that has allowed almost unlimited amounts of money to pour into the two political parties. Isn't it very, very naive to expect to turn something that around through the occupation of a park in Manhattan?
I wouldn't say that it was naive. I would say that we were testing a hypothesis that was dominant within contemporary activism. I think for many, many, many years, we've been told a storyline, which is that if you can get millions of people to do a unified behavior, largely nonviolently, around a singular demand, then change will happen. That if we were to occupy the squares, we believe that Obama would be forced to listen and that change would happen. And so it's not that it was naive, it's that we were actually kind of acting out a story that we've been told. But at the same time, once we achieved that, and we have to remember, like, it's extremely difficult to achieve that. We might not see another Occupy Wall Street type movement that spreads to 82 countries for 10, 20, 30 years. We don't know. So to achieve that is extremely difficult. And in achieving it, we realize that that story is no longer true. So I wouldn't say it was naive. I would say it was kind of like magical thinking, you know? But at that time, you have to remember, the Arab Spring did topple Mubarak. It did topple the leader in Tunisia. So we were in a revolutionary moment, and people were changing their societies.
I'm interested in your comparison, because you make that comparison a lot between Occupy Wall Street and the Arab Spring movement. Are those comparisons appropriate? Surely you would agree that people in the Arab Spring were literally risking their lives in many cases to step out into those squares. And people in Zuccotti Park in Manhattan, I don't think were risking their lives. In fact, people in Zuccotti Park were enjoying the enormous liberties that they're allowed in the United States to demonstrate peacefully and very publicly, whereas those rights aren't at all part of the story in the Arab world. Are the comparisons apt?
That's a really good question. You have to remember, though, that Occupy Wall Street basically came out of taking the Tahrir Square tactic of going to a mass location and demanding, you know, that someone step down, with the movement that was happening in Spain. So we combined those two into Occupy Wall Street and put it onto the occupation of Wall Street. So it was part of the storyline that we saw ourselves as part of the same global movement. But you're absolutely right that oppression manifests differently. And if I, as one of the creators of Occupy Wall Street, if I were in Egypt right now and I would have been a creator of the Tahrir Square uprising, I would probably be dead. I would be in jail. Instead, what they do in America is they starve you economically. But you also have to remember that 7,000 people in America were arrested. People died during Occupy Wall Street. Someone died in Vancouver. Someone died in Oakland. People had their bones broken. So it's important also not to diminish the severity and the reality of what thousands of people were doing, quitting their jobs, getting arrested, getting bones broken, dying in some cases. It was a real revolutionary moment, and I think it was an American version of the Arab Spring.
Where does the protest movement go from here? That's largely what your book is about. You refer to technology. I believe what you're saying is should make the protest movement more nimble. You refer to the protest movement in the future being able to emerge and withdraw very quickly as to triumph before the status quo and law enforcement mobilized to react. You also quote Thomas Jefferson saying that a generation that begins a revolution is not the same generation that concludes it. So what is the protest movement of the future going to look like, do you think?
The core idea is that social movements are going to start winning elections in multiple countries in order to carry out a unified political agenda. We're going to see social movements that arise very suddenly before an election, that swing the election, and aren't just satisfied with one election, but then do it in multiple countries. And I think we're seeing the development of that in Spain with Podemos, in Italy with Five Star Movement, and now in Germany with Diem. So the future is social movements that can win elections through using spontaneous behaviors and swinging the election.
In Toronto in 2010, we had the G20 summit here of G20 nations. We also, as I'm sure you know, had very, very strong demonstrations against the G20. We had, among other things, very disappointing and inappropriate behavior by our police department. Most people agree now as we look back. The city is still really struggling all these years later with what went on. But we also had violence from protesters themselves, smashed windows, cars set on fire, a lot of violence. In May, you were asked about violence by a questioner, I believe, in Brazil, and you said this: studies suggest that protesters who use violence are more effective than do not. I think violence is effective, but only in the short term, because you end up developing a kind of organized structure that's easy for police to infiltrate. Now, that doesn't sound to me like a full-throated denunciation of violence on the part of protesters. Are you for or against violence in protests?
Protest is a form of war. It is a way of influencing politics by unconventional means, which is the definition that Clausewitz gives of war. But I think that the fundamental thing to realize is that nonviolent social movements are, going forward, I think going to be seen as the most effective form of war. So violence and nonviolence, I think that misses the deeper question, which is we do have to start understanding that protest is a form of warfare. But at the same time, I think that the best form of warfare that protests can take is a kind of nonviolent social movement that's able to win elections in multiple countries in order to carry out a unified political agenda. But if you look at things like ISIS, that would be an example of a weaponized social movement. But at the same time, I think a weaponized social movement versus a nonviolent social movement, the nonviolent social movement is going to be ultimately the long-term victor.
I think a lot of people would think it's reasonable to ask, plain and simple, is it acceptable for protesters to throw rocks through windows when they're protesting global economic policies?
Acceptable?
Yeah.
Or effective?
Acceptable behavior on the part of protesters.
Yes.
Should society put up with that?
Yes, yes, yes. Because it's absolutely. I think that it's not effective. I think it's one of the protest rituals and behaviors that we've kind of, repeated. But I don't think it's unacceptable behavior. Okay.
What about the climate change movement that we see around the world gathering a lot of steam and I think a lot of success as well? A lot of people, mainstream people, well outside the protest movement, now accept the premise and the science behind climate change. Governments are moving on it. We saw an agreement in Paris. Even energy companies, the producers of oil and gas, are at least talking the talk on climate change. What's that telling you about the state of the modern protest movement? It looks to me like a big success.
This is the thing, is that I think that one of the problems with contemporary activism is that we've lowered our horizon of possibility. And right now, the dominant kind of narrative is that the best we can do is raise awareness about things and get the people in power to kind of parrot our language. And I think that that's what we've basically achieved with the climate movement, is that we've gotten to a situation where, yeah, we've raised awareness around this issue enough that people in power seem to parrot the language of the environmental movement. But have we gotten into a position where we actually have a binding global agreement that's going to substantially change the way that our economies are run in order to have a long-term reversal of climate change, or at least mitigation? Have we come to a situation where borders have been eradicated so that climate refugees are allowed to freely move across borders just like capital is? No, obviously not. So to achieve these wider and deeper revolutionary changes, needs a social movement. I think that we need to stop pinning our hopes on just trying to get people in power to kind of use our language. You know, I mean, it's kind of like how in arts and culture, like, yeah, like when you create cool new kinds of music, eventually it makes its way into advertising commercials. But that doesn't mean that you've succeeded, you know. So social movements need to constantly remind themselves that the ultimate goal is to become the ones in power, not just influencing the ones in power.
Okay, last thought, Bernie Sanders. What do you think of his success thus far?
I think it's a positive thing, but again, it's not the ultimate goal. He's a symptom of Occupy Wall Street, but what we need is a social movement that can actually get into power.